Imagine a painting so horrifying, so grotesque, that for decades it was hidden from the world. In Francisco Goya's Saturn Devouring His Son, we witness a monstrous god hunched over a tiny corpse mid-feast. Saturn's wild, bulging eyes and gnashing teeth make him seem ravenous and insane. His hands dig into the limp body of his child. Blood is splattered on the monster's face and drips from his mouth. The little body is already half-eaten, its limbs twisted and mangled in agony. The whole scene is lit by stark highlights of white flesh and red blood against deep shadow, creating an atmosphere of despair and horror. It is as if Goya has captured a waking nightmare on canvas, the very face of parental violence gone beyond all reason. To understand why this image is so shocking, we must remember the myth behind it. Saturn, the Roman name for the Greek Kronos, devoured his children to prevent a prophecy that would overthrow him. In myth, Saturn often swallows his offspring whole, and his wife Rhea hides the youngest, Jupiter, to save him. Goya knows this myth, but he shows something even more brutal. Here, Saturn tears apart the baby in front of us, and as one scholar notes, the human head and part of the left arm have already been consumed, and the god's mouth gapes and his eyes bulge wildly as he prepares to take another bite. There is nothing distant or symbolic about this. It is raw, visceral horror made real. Why would a painter of royal portraits create such a chilling image? By the late 1810s, Francisco Goya was an old man, broken by misfortune. In 1819, he moved into a country house outside Madrid called the Quinta del Sordo, the villa of the deaf man. Fittingly, Goya himself was nearly deaf by then. The survivor of a mysterious illness in 1792, he was 72 years old, frail, and full of pain. In the years before, Spain had been ravaged by the Napoleonic Wars. The royal household was in chaos, and Goya had witnessed atrocities in his famous war paintings. He even lost his beloved wife Josefa around this time. By the time he painted Saturn, Goya had survived 2 near-fatal illnesses and grew increasingly anxious and impatient in fear of relapse. He described a life haunted by panic, terror, and relentless fear. In his solitude and fear, his art changed. Goya stopped painting bright tapestries and flattering court scenes. Instead, he poured his nightmares onto the walls of his home. As art historians note, the Black paintings, the series to which Saturn belongs, portray intense, haunting themes born of his fear of insanity and his bleak outlook on humanity. He painted these images only for himself. According to a Guardian review, Goya covered the walls of his villa with art, suggesting that the images he created there were made only for himself. They were never meant as commissions or public works. In fact, Goya never mentioned them to anyone, and next to nobody would see them until years after he was dead. In his isolation, Goya's home became a confessional or a kind of self-made prison for his darkest visions. What made Saturn Devouring His Son even more infamous was that it was literally hidden in a house called the Deaf Man's Villa. Goya painted it as a private mural on the dining room wall, alongside 13 other Black paintings. He did not title it or explain it. He didn't even show them to friends or patrons. By design, these pictures stayed locked behind the doors of his villa. A modern summary puts it plainly. Goya painted Saturn on the interior wall of his home, never meant to be shown to the public. These were not like his royal portraits or commissioned altarpieces. They were personal, angry outbursts, not commissioned and not meant to leave his home, as one source emphasizes. For all those years, Saturn hung silent on the wall, its horror unseen. Goya never intended audiences to feel its shock. Indeed, scholars note he never intended the picture for public exhibition. The family itself did not release it. It's said his descendants found the paintings too disturbing to display. Thus, for decades, the world didn't know this monster existed. It would take a long time before Saturn Devouring His Son saw the light of day. Goya died in 1828, still under the belief that no one else would ever see his secret murals. The black paintings stayed on the walls of Quinta del Sordo, unattended and aging. Finally, half a century later, the house changed hands. In 1874, the new owner, Baron Emil de Erlanger, realized the murals were crumbling and needed to be saved. Under the direction of the Prado's chief conservator, Salvador Martinez Cubels, the 14 paintings were painstakingly cut from the walls and transferred to canvas. Imagine the shock when experts saw Saturn on a stretcher, a blood-smeared nightmare that had lived in secret for decades. These canvases were then exhibited in Paris in 1878, and soon after, the Baron donated them to the Spanish state. By 1881, Saturn Devouring His Son finally took its place in the Prado Museum in Madrid. At long last, it was open to the public. Art lovers walking the Prado's halls could now stand before the painting and feel that same fear Goya had meant to provoke. But for all that time, the painting had remained virtually unknown, hidden for a century after Goya painted it. Today, nearly 2 centuries after its creation, Saturn Devouring His Son still haunts people. Viewers describe an uneasy horror when they see those wild eyes and raw flesh. In the psychology of art, it is often cited as the pinnacle of nightmare imagery, the ultimate expression of a tortured mind. It taps into a primal fear, the taboo of violence by a parent against a child, and even cannibalism. Experts have noted that the painting's raw brushwork and distorted figures evoke intense fear, chaos, and psychological torment, inspired by Goya's own experiences. In other words, its shock is no accident. It is built to unsettle us. The painting's influence goes beyond galleries. Its nightmarish power has crept into movies and culture. For example, Oliver Stone's Wall Street, Money Never Sleeps, features the painting hanging on the wall of a ruthless executive, a grim metaphor for corporate greed as a kind of cannibalism. More strikingly, analyses of Stanley Kubrick's horror masterpiece The Shining point out that Goya's Saturn directly inspired the film's visual tone. In fact, an essay on Kubrick's work notes that Goya's Saturn Devouring His Son was explicitly included among the paintings that guided certain scenes and imagery in the film. In other words, decades after Goya, the same image still lights up the darkest corners of modern storytelling. Even in high art, the legacy lingers. Many artists and critics point to Saturn as the ultimate dark painting, a work that refuses to let us turn away from its violence. Its themes, time as a devourer, the madness of power, or the cycle of violence, continue to resonate. In discussions of art and psychology, it's mentioned as a case where an artist's private demons became a public nightmare. 200 years on, Saturn Devouring His Son remains a terrifying sight. It's not just a curiosity in a museum, it's a visceral experience. As Goya's own words might have warned, if he dared to name it, this painting shows us a truth we'd rather not face. Perhaps, as one might whisper in closing, some paintings were never meant to be seen.